So do you think this is going to be the final recording or just a draft?
You've got some bad puns.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't understand yet, this episode is going to be about the draft and selective service, the idea of needing to or being forced to fight for your country, whether that be for a war without or for a war within. So the question is it ethical to have a draft where you force citizens of a country to fight for the sovereignty of that country or in a war external to that country? So let's start off with a war within, one where you are defending the country. Should citizens of the country be expected by the government to help defend the country from an invasion?
I think they should be. These invaders are coming to your home, maybe not necessarily your house, but it could be your city or your state that you love, and it would be on us to defend it. Nobody else is going to step in and protect us.
Sure. And particularly in today's world with the UN or the number of countries and the interconnectivity between countries, you could expect in some cases that other countries would actually help out.
In some cases. But the U.S. tends to provide a lot more military aid than a lot of other countries.
So if the U.S. were to be invaded, then you think that the draft would be a viable option?
I hope we don't make it that far where we have to use it, and hope that we have enough volunteers. But if we don't, then yeah.
And I think it doesn't make sense from the start, because in the end, any law implemented by a government, at least in modern times, is enforced at the threat of a gun, or at the point of a gun. That if you don't follow a law, you can be fined or arrested, and in those cases, as things escalate, if you refuse to follow the law, if you refuse to be arrested, if you're resisting, in the end, it can be enforced at the point of a gun. The draft is no exception. The draft is a law, and if a government is saying you have to fight for your country, and if you don't, then you are a fugitive from the law, and you could be arrested, and a gun could end up being pointed at you in an attempt to force you to obey the law. So if you're drafting someone, you're basically giving them the choice of, hey, either fight against the enemy that we want you to fight against, or we'll point our guns at you instead of the enemy. So it's like pointing two guns at your head instead of one.
But if we ever made it to the point of needing the draft, you're already going to have the gun of the enemy pointed at your head.
If that isn't enough to convince you to fight, then why should your own government point its guns at you and force you to fight? If you don't view that your country is worth protecting or worth fighting for, why should the government be responsible for convincing you of that?
Well, in some cases, we may not have people in the right places to protect the country. If, say, California was being invaded, I don't think we're going to have a lot of people from Texas who want to help protect California.
That's potentially fair. I think I understand what you're getting at there. But if California is incapable of defending itself for whatever reason that may be, I mean, aren't they just getting what's coming to them?
I think to a point, but they are a part of the country as a whole. So that brings up an interesting point, though, of if I was asked to defend something, am I more likely to defend my city, my state, or my country?
Well, and it's also, particularly for a large country like the U.S. that covers a wide variety of people, should the other individuals throughout the country be forced to help protect other members of that state? And that is part of the idea of the United States, is that you do fight for each other and to protect each other. I like the California example because California at this point has incredibly strict gun laws, meaning that if they were to be invaded, especially considering they are a coastal state, they would be less capable of protecting themselves, as in the citizens would be less capable of protecting themselves against that invasion because they are more disarmed than the rest of the country. So should other states where people do have more experience with firearms or have more firearms be expected to put their own lives on the line because of the mistakes that California made to put themselves in a position where they're more susceptible to an invasion? And I realize we're talking really deep hypotheticals here of California being invaded, but my point is, if you are in an area where the decisions that you've made governmentally and legally have put you in a position that you are more likely to get invaded because you've left yourself more susceptible, why should other individuals bear the burden of defending you when you won't even defend yourself?
That's true. And right now, California would be relying on the national military to defend them. So the United States Army, Air Force, the Navy.
Which, as you mentioned, is much more likely to come from Texas, because those are the types of individuals that are more likely to actually join the military, as opposed to what we see in particularly the far left-wing culture in California, where people are less likely to join the military because they don't like the idea of having a military.
Right. And if people in the military are in it to truly defend their country, they're not going to have a problem defending California, as much as they may not agree with California's ideas.
The idea, I forgot where the statement comes from, but I disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it.
Yep, I've definitely heard that one before.
And I think that's valid, that even if people aren't best suited or well suited to fight against an invasion, we still need to protect them and protect their ideologies, because a difference in ideology is frequently a good thing.
Exactly.
On the flip side of that, though, again, with the idea of having sovereignty, there's an increasing desire to just get rid of borders. The idea that, I'm betting that you've heard the statement, no one is illegal. There's no such thing as an illegal human. Are you familiar with that?
Yep.
Which is the idea of, look, there should be no borders whatsoever. And if there are no borders, then you don't agree with the idea of sovereignty, meaning that you're okay with getting invaded. Should that idea be protected by a military? Because the whole purpose of a military protecting against a foreign invasion is to maintain sovereignty. If you don't believe in sovereignty, should your ideas or ideals no longer be protected?
I think you're going to have to protect them to a point. You know, if other people enter my society and do bad things like murder people and rape my women, yeah, we're going to have to defend ourselves against them.
It's interesting you bring that up, because this kind of goes back to our conversation about borders and illegal immigration. And if you look statistically, for a lot of the individuals that are coming over from the Mexico border to the U.S., there is an increased likelihood of committing a crime. Particularly if you just look at Southern California, the crime rates, drug usage rates, and rates of violence in those cities is very, very high compared to the rest of the country. And also associated with that, the illegal immigrant population is also very high. So I realize we're talking about the draft and protection of a country, but I think that's another good example of, there is an ideology there that maybe we just shouldn't enforce these laws. So the idea of sanctuary cities is a really good example. Oh, people are coming over, we're going to ignore the laws of our own country for the sake of a different ideology that we believe in. So should resources be going to those regions to protect from a threat that the rest of the country views as a threat, but those local regions don't view as a threat? Because to me, that's sort of, I don't want to say invasion, because it's not necessarily an invasion force, but a flooding in of people, or a, let's say, peaceful taking control of those regions. Should resources from the rest of the country be put into forcing an ideology on them, the ideology of sovereignty, or should they just be left to their own devices, because you reap what you sow, and the decisions that you're making, positive or negative, you should be the one to follow those decisions?
And in that case, I think it is a situation of you reap what you sow. I don't think you're going to be able to convince a lot of other people to go to those cities and try to change what they're doing because you don't really have the support of that city.
Right. And you can only do so much.
Exactly. So in those cases, we'd have to leave them alone. As much as the rest of the country may not like what they're doing, they're going to get what's coming to them eventually.
And to bring up a specific example of a way that you can coax individuals into changing their ways, to bring up a specific Trump example, the idea of sanctuary cities, where they say, we will not be deporting anyone, and we want to be able to support as many people coming over as possible. So the Trump administration said, okay, we'll take a bunch of illegal immigrants that we've captured, and instead of deporting them, we'll send them over to sanctuary cities. Here you go. And those cities got really, really upset with that there was an increased burden on those local cities, and they weren't able to absorb that much of an impact. So you don't have to necessarily say, oh, no, we're going to force you to follow our laws, but you can coax them into showing them the error of their ways.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Without necessarily being problematic. And I don't know how well that's working, but it's an idea. It's a peaceful idea that, okay, you want to do this, we will help you in doing it. And technically, that's arguably exactly what should be done by a government organization, is help different cities perform what they want to do, even if it's against the law, which I find it really entertaining that the Trump administration was helping them do the thing that they wanted to do, and then they got upset that they were doing the thing that they said they wanted to do.
I feel like they just didn't understand the sheer volume of people that they would have to deal with.
Possibly. But we're getting a little off topic. So to bring it back in a little bit, the idea of preparation and you reap what you sow. Let's bring up Switzerland. Because in Switzerland, and I believe a couple other, possibly Sweden, but a couple countries, particularly in Europe, require some sort of military or civil service, particularly from men, that you are expected to go through a certain level of training with a firearm in military service, and then either serve in the military, either active or reserve, or do some sort of government civil service prior to going out into the workforce and doing what you wish. That's a good example of reaping what you sow, in the sense that if you train all men in your country or all individuals in your country to some extent with military service, you are much less likely to be invaded. You are much less likely to fail to defend your country if you are invaded. So that's a positive example of you reap what you sow, because you're well prepared. On the flip side, though, I think a lot of people have the idea of, if you don't do that, you still shouldn't just be left to be crushed or invaded. We should still protect your idea of sovereignty, even if you didn't defend it. And I guess the question is, do you think that countries that don't believe in sovereignty, or believe in sovereignty enough to be prepared against an invasion, should they be protected from elsewhere?
I think they should be protected from elsewhere.
So, for instance, Poland during World War II.
Right. Ideally, they would supply their own protection, because they're trying to keep their own way of life, but otherwise, their allies could definitely help support them when needed. Part of the problem, though, would be getting support from those allies.
Especially when it's an unprovoked or unexpected attack. So Poland had no reason to build up a massive military, because it didn't realize that Germany was building a massive military. So they didn't have a huge standing military. It didn't make sense for them to be building a bunch of resources, because there was no need to build those resources. So I think that the idea of you reap what you sow, particularly in not being prepared enough, doesn't hold all that much water, because you don't necessarily know when you need to be prepared. There's a certain minimum level, but what is an acceptable minimum level is only determined after the war has already started. Right,
and you only get that knowledge as well if you've been in prior wars. Even if a new war comes up and you may not be quite at the level you wanted to be at least you'll have something around because oh, these previous wars we were in, we needed X amount of supplies. Let's have some sort of reserves available in that realm.
And having reserves is important, whether it be for war or unexpected famine, disease. That's part of the reason that I think we have government, is to help with that preparation and being prepared for the unknown. And I guess then the question of the draft is, when you aren't prepared for that unknown, and if it's the government's job to be prepared for that unknown, should they be able to then compensate for the unexpected values or the unexpected occurrences by drafting people and forcing them to fight, or at least forcing them to contribute to their country in a new way besides what they would freely choose?
I think there's no real way around it. If you are not prepared and something comes up, you have to make with what you have. Even if you don't have enough now, well, we have a way to get more people. So we need to take advantage of that in times of dire need. I think it's especially important to consider the other contributions. I don't think that everybody who is needed by the government would need to go into a combat situation. They could be utilized to work in factories or help with communications or something along those lines. And I think that's an important distinction as well.
And in particular, we saw that in World War II with a lot of the propaganda of, we need you, not just the men for fighting, but also women who picked up a lot of fabrication and factory jobs to help with the war effort. They were still making money, making products, and helping with the war effort, even though they weren't actively fighting or dying. So most individuals are able to help out. Now, there is an exception to that. I believe there is a minimum requirement for being drafted, particularly for men that are going into anything that will touch a combat scenario, that you have a required minimum IQ, even in the draft, of 85. That the U.S. military has done research and testing and determined that if you have an IQ of below 85, you are more of a risk to the group around you than you are a help, and you just detract from the ability to defend the country. And what I'm trying to say is that not everyone will actually be able to contribute to the draft, so determining who can and can't actually help the country is something you'll need to do, but that also gives people an out, because if they can pretend to be dumb enough, then they can avoid the draft and avoid helping their country. But again, the idea of you reap what you sow, if you have enough people that they pretend to be stupid so that they don't have to protect their country, I think it's a good requirement to have, because you're protecting people, and even though it gives people an out or an ability to dodge the draft, those are not the type of people that you would want to be protecting your country. And if enough people do that such that you lose the war, so be it. You have voted with your collective intelligence that we don't believe that we have the right to be our own sovereign nation because we weren't willing to fight.
And I think that makes sense, especially in the case of IQ. Even if you have a lower IQ, yes, maybe you can't be in the military, but you could still do something to help the war effort in many of these cases. And protecting the other people that we have drafted is really important. Most people do not like the idea of being drafted. You are being taken away from your home, your family, to someplace you have never been before in many cases.
And even if it's protecting your own country, you may be going to a different part of the country that you wouldn't have otherwise necessarily been. For instance, if California gets invaded, people from Texas will end up going over to California. That's the way it would be.
Right. So it's already a huge burden on those people that are being drafted. So you want to make sure that you utilize them well. So in that case, it does make some sense to have standards for who you bring in.
And while it does risk giving an out to people who want to be able to avoid the draft, that comes back to the idea of you reap what you sow. And, well, if you give a loose enough requirement that people can avoid the draft and you end up losing the war and you can't defend your country, you kind of get what you deserve. that your country was apparently not worth preserving to the best of our collective knowledge can determine. So what about just in general, kind of going along with the lines of you reap what you sow, the idea of Switzerland preparing themselves by requiring military training for all the men and having a firearm throughout their lives be available. In the U.S., we don't have that, but I think there's less of a need for it considering the level of gun ownership.
I think that's a little bit tricky as well, though, because gun ownership tends to be in specific areas of the country. If we're talking about California, many people there have never even touched a gun, much less fired one.
Interestingly, though, many people there want to own firearms but can't because arguably the large cities that actually have gun violence problems are implementing statewide laws restricting gun ownership, meaning that a lot of the people in California or other left-leaning states that want to be able to own firearms can't because of the restrictions implemented by the cities.
Right, so in those areas, you don't really have people trained to use firearms. Granted, a place like Texas, they're probably okay, and
Right.
they can defend themselves. But California, they're not really prepared for that.
Sure. And the reason I bring up the U.S. and just general gun ownership is in World War II, I forgot who it was, but I think a Japanese general stated, you cannot invade the United States mainland because there will be a rifle behind every blade of grass. And I think it's a valid idea that when you have enough guns in the country, even if there are restricted areas or areas where there's fewer guns per person, there will still be guns all over the place. As an invader, you don't know where those guns are. You don't know how many there are. You don't know who has the guns. It makes it very difficult to invade a country when gun ownership is very, very high, regardless of whether or not people are experienced with it, because
Yeah, in a life or death situation, I'm not going to think about, oh my gosh, how do I do this? No, I'm just going to do it. It may not be perfect, but man, I'm going to hit that guy.
And regardless of the person's training, if I see someone with a gun in their hands and it's pointed generally in my direction, I'm going to think twice about moving in that direction or moving at all, because even if they don't have very good accuracy, they may still end up trying to shoot at me, and there's a chance that they will hit me. So having the guns there is, I think, significantly better than not having guns there for the idea of protecting your country and its sovereignty. Whether or not you have the training like countries like Switzerland do, where they are actively trained and are expected to contribute to the government in some way, whether that be through civil service or through military service. So in the U.S., do you think that having the guns there is enough, or should there be training associated with it and civil service associated with the training?
I would certainly like to see the training. I'm of the opinion that a lot of people in the U.S. are scared of guns because they're not familiar with them. You know, when you are around them and you know how to use them safely, they're not as scary of a thing.
And I've seen that personally with people who have never held or physically seen a firearm. I can take them out to a shooting range and in a safe and controlled manner, show them the ropes. Here's how to be safe about it. Here's how to protect yourself. Here's how to shoot. And invariably, everyone that I've taken out is like, that was a lot more fun than I expected and a lot less scary. It may not change their opinion on overall gun ownership of, well, I still think we need more restrictions, which is fine. But I have pretty universally seen a positive reaction when people are exposed to firearms in a controlled way and not in a, oh my gosh, someone's shooting at me way.
Right. And then if it came down to the, oh my gosh, someone's shooting at me situation, they would be more prepared if they had to take action.
To an extent. I mean,
right. They're not going to be perfect by any means.
Even if you're trained, or at least you have practiced and gone to the range a lot, if someone's actively shooting at you, it is going to completely change how you're handling the situation.
Right. But at least having some knowledge can help you.
Yes. And I think more importantly, if you hear a gunshot, it may change how you react to the situation because you try to figure out what's going on instead of going into an immediate panic of, oh my God, everyone's going to die.
Yes, that's a good point.
So one of the things that you brought up was the idea of, or that I had brought up the idea of required training. And you seem to agree with that of having some sort of training. We've been generally talking about men being in the civil servant and military training aspect because historically, everyone that has fought a war, for the most part, has been men. I think the United States Revolutionary War was an exception to that, or at least an exception that I'm aware of to that, where both men and women were expected to be proficient to an extent with firearms because when another army may be coming into your home, you would want to be able to protect yourself, protect your wife, or protect your kids, which extends also to the wife and to the women, that you should be able to protect your home. So that's an instance where you would see firearm proficiency in both men and women because you're protecting the sovereignty of your country and the sovereignty of your home. So in modern times, if men are expected to partake in the draft or partake in civil servitude, should women also be required to do that?
I think so. I think that there's not that much of a difference people-wise that would mean that men should do it and women shouldn't. Now, they might have to do different jobs. You know, a woman may be doing more something with communications or supply chain or something like that, whereas more men might be in combat, but they would still have something they could contribute.
Are you saying that women are less capable than men?
I mean, considering the number of guys at the gym who warm up with my max deadlift, I've seen it in person.
So let me get this straight. You're agreeing that there is a physical difference between men and women?
I know.
Gasp. Oh my gosh. Now, related to that, you were mentioning women can go into other professions. So part of what makes men more suited for combat roles is physicality. The ability to do high intensity work for a long period of time and not get as fatigued. I mean, obviously men do get fatigued over a period of time, but they are more capable of doing it than women in general. Would you agree with that?
Generally, yes.
And you mentioned deadlifting, and would you say that someone who spends a male who spends the same amount of time as you do doing a deadlift, he will end up being more capable or being able to do it for a longer period of time with heavier weights?
Oh, absolutely.
And particularly in combat where you have to carry 70 to 100 pounds of material and weapons and armor around with you, you need to be able to have that capability in a combat situation.
Yep.
So if let's say we have minimum standards of physicality and capability to be able to go into a combat role. And this is something that we're increasingly seeing just in general military service, even if it's not in the draft. If women meet those requirements, the same requirements as are laid out for men, should they also be able to be put into military service? For instance, if they're drafted, if they meet the minimum requirements, should they be put into combat roles?
I think it's something that we have to think about. I'm not totally against it by any means. But
you're saying you want women to die?
Saying I want equality.
One of the reasons that I'm giving you a tough time for this is, are you familiar with men's rights activists?
Not super familiar.
They get a lot of flack, but one of the things that they fight for is men and women being treated equally across the board. And one of the things that they talk about is the idea of the draft, where men have been historically the only ones where their lives are actively put on the line, and women are not. So should women be put into combat roles if they meet the requirements?
I see no reason not to. If they're meeting the requirements, then it makes sense.
And interestingly, I don't think so. There have been some experiments being done, particularly in the U.S. military, where there are co-ed combat groups. So where both men and women who meet minimum standards for combat capabilities are put into the same groups, and they fight together as a unit. What they've noticed is the men will voluntarily take up a heavier load and put themselves more in harm's way for the sake of protecting the women. And I think that I don't know if there's been a causal analysis that has been conclusively completed, but I would assume that it has to do with an instinctual protection of as we've evolved, we have instincts of I need to protect women because women produce children and children propagate the species. Therefore, I need to protect women. So even if it's not an intentional, conscious thing, we are instinctually predisposed to attempt to protect women in some way. And particularly when you are in a life-threatening situation and people are shooting at you, while you feel a feeling of brotherhood towards other men, or while men feel a feeling of brotherhood towards other men, I think that there's a different feeling associated with other humans that are female because there is an added incentive to protect them, which is why we have the phrase women and children first, because we generally view those individuals as less capable of defending themselves and, I think more accurately, more valuable to protect. And because of that, it changes how you handle a combat situation. It's not that those people don't think that women can hold their own. It's that if there's any intrinsic bias of seeing women as the more valuable individuals that need additional protecting, you're more likely to put yourself in harm's way, which can mess with the coherence of the team.
That makes sense. But what about the case of a women-only team? I forgot which Middle Eastern country it was. I'm kind of thinking...
Israel?
Yes. That's kind of who I thought was they do have women-only teams in their military. And they are doing pretty well.
Which I think could work better than co-ed teams, which... Oh, this is going to sound terrible, but separate but equal.
This is probably one of the few times where it might make sense.
And I think in those cases, it's still possible if there are volunteer missions where you need a unit to go and do a risky task. The men may still be more likely to do it if they know that there are female teams. But at that case, I think you're detached enough that the functionality of the unit won't be affected. And if you have higher ups deciding which unit goes where, as long as the units are capable and they meet certain minimum standards, I don't see any problem with having separate units. I think the problem, at least experimentally, has been that if you have co-ed units where people are directly interacting on a person-to-person basis between men and women, that's where it can become problematic just because men are more likely to take on a heavier burden than they otherwise would, meaning that they're less likely to function as a team, which... It's really unfortunate that that's the way it is, but that is at least what has been experimentally shown at this point. And that may change as society grows, but I don't think that we're there yet. And so the idea of slowly working women into the military, even in separate units, again, assuming that they meet the same physical requirements, I think is a good idea.
Well, we can agree on something.
Yes, women should be put in harm's way. I agree. Now, that being said, not all women, and arguably most women, will not be able to meet the standards for combat readiness, meaning that the majority would still be men. Which, at least the requirements are equal, and I think as long as the requirements are equal, cool.
Yeah,
Quality.
They are moving towards more equal requirements with a newer test now.
Right. Which ironically is going to mean that fewer women actually get into combat roles.
Yep.
Which I have no problem with. Equality of opportunity, yes. Equality of outcome, no. I don't think you're going to argue for having 50% of the active combat roles be women.
No. it's probably not going to work out so well.
Particularly if there are men that are going to be significantly better capable. But that also brings up the question of, if you're doing a draft, you're not going to just need combat roles. You need production roles, communications, like you had mentioned, reconnaissance, just strategic analysis, communication with other countries, ambassadors. In those cases, women can contribute just as well, sometimes better than men. So, should women be equally viewed as a resource that can be utilized in a draft for non-combat roles?
Absolutely.
Treat them equally to men.
Yep.
Same requirements. Everyone gets drafted equally, and based on how you test across multivariate analysis, so not just testing for physicality, but also intelligence, emotional stability, ethicality, you can find a job to put people in regardless of their gender.
Yeah. Because there's always going to be something that has to be done.
Absolutely. And I think the only thing that we need to be careful of is how individuals intermingle within those spaces. Again, because we don't know exactly where problems are going to occur. And we're kind of seeing how that works in the workforce, because over the past 60 or 70 years, men and women have been intermingling in the workforce, and I don't think it's becoming increasingly problematic, but we're seeing some throws and thrashes with an increased strictness in sexual harassment. And I don't think it's that sexual harassment cases are increasing. I think that people's interpretation of, oh, someone touched my shoulder, that is sexual harassment because I felt like he was coming on to me. And I think that we're getting to the point where men and women are working together. What is the actual expectation there? What is okay? What is not? And especially as we've gone through the sexual revolution, when men and women are in the same place working together, how do we handle sexual desire in that case? And I think that in the military, especially when you may be away from family for a long period of time, and there are going to be a lot of single people, that question comes up maybe more than usual.
Yes. And it's definitely something that needs to be considered in these cases.
And do we just forbid any sort of sexual interaction because then you have the government telling you who you can and can't have sex with?
And let's face it, that's not going to be... what's the right word? You're not going to be able to enforce that very well.
It's not a viable solution.
Right. So there will be some things going on, no matter what you do.
And I think that that's what we're trying to discover in the workforce right now is, to what degree should there be regulation over what you can and can't do of a sexual nature when men and women are put together? But again, because we're going off on another tangent here, back to the draft of, I think we agree that both men and women should be drafted in equal numbers and put to different professions based on how they test over a multivariate analysis. But they should be treated equal and held to the same standards, even if that means that the distribution of where they go is different.
Yes.
And I think that this is one of the important things that we'll cover in another episode of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And that's kind of what we've been discussing here. So I think that we agree on that. So let's now turn it to, again, well, staying away from the specifics of a war within versus a war without. We'll come back to that. But what about people who are already contributing to something that is related to the military, but they're not actively involved in the military? So for instance, if there's an aeronautical engineer at Boeing and then they get drafted, should they be drafted and then put into a combat role, or should they continue working at Boeing, who's going to probably start developing military aircraft?
I actually think that they should be staying at Boeing where they are, because they could be more useful there. Not everybody could be an engineer.
So perhaps add a requirement to the draft that if you are already in a profession that the government views as a benefit to the military, then you are no longer included on the list of the draft, which would encourage people, even in peacetime, there is a small incentive to get a job that contributes to the military in some way such that you don't have to worry about being drafted.
Right. These jobs would tend to be higher tech, and they would probably live better lives anyway in many of these cases too.
And so it's just an added bonus of, hey, you won't be drafted.
Yep.
Or at least you will not be our first pick to be drafted. That if we start running out of people, we may start going to other professions, but it decreases the likelihood of you being drafted. And I'm perfectly fine with that carrot on a stick incentive. It's more of, hey, we're not going to give you the rod, but I think it's still a good and fair incentive. And that also works for women, because if women end up going into the STEM fields, and particularly in jobs that could contribute to the military, then they wouldn't be as likely to be drafted. So I think that benefits both men and women, and it encourages them to go into the STEM fields.
So it's a win-win.
I agree. It's a win-win. Although I think that it can only decrease your likelihood. That particularly for what we were talking about with a war within, that you are being invaded, you're going to need probably more actual fighters, meaning that even if you do have a job that's supporting the military, there's a significantly higher likelihood that you're going to be needed anyway and drafted into some sort of a combat role.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So shall we transition and start talking about a war without?
I think so.
Because this, I think, is where a lot of the controversy comes from. We saw this in the Vietnam War, I believe the Korea War, and elsewhere. Interestingly, World War II, I don't think that the draft seemed to really be a problem.
Yeah, I don't think so. I haven't heard anything about it.
Right. It's possible that there were problems associated with it, but it was one of those things where, particularly for the U.S., after Pearl Harbor was attacked, there was more of a reason to get involved in the war. And it was a war that a lot of people did not want to get involved in because we weren't directly involved. And then when we got attacked, it's like, okay,
now's the time.
We're going to hit back now. But for the other wars, for instance, Vietnam, that was more of an ideological war. And it was being fought for the sake of, oh, they're communist, and communism is going to spread like an infection, and we need to fight the infection. And so it's not a direct threat, like a direct military threat, but it's an ideological threat. So to what degree should the draft be used for wars that are fought outside of your country?
I think that's a tricky one, because you need people in your country to support that war. If they do not support it, then if you were to draft people, everyone's going to be pissed off. And the people you draft are not going to fight as effectively, because they don't really think of these other people that you're fighting as an enemy as much.
So if you're fighting in a war that is outside of your country's borders, should the only individuals that you should be able to use as a resource be the ones that join voluntarily? You can have efforts to say, hey, we really need you guys. Hey, please join the military, but not be able to force individuals.
Right. I think that's the way that you would have to go to be able to fight your war well.
Let people vote with their lives because it's something that they're actually willing to fight for, as opposed to trying to dodge the draft or pretending to be insane or stupid to be able to get out of the draft in order to avoid it. If you're forcing people to fight for an idea that they don't agree with when they aren't in a direct threat, they're not as likely to try as hard or be willing to fight.
Exactly.
Does it depend on what type of war you're fighting elsewhere? So, for instance, in Vietnam, it was effectively an ideological war. The idea of capitalism versus communism. People in the government were afraid that communism would start spreading and be a risk to our country eventually, and wanted to squash it while we could. And that's an idea that not everyone agreed with, but that's partially because they may not have been exposed to some of the bigger picture aspects, so then they couldn't have been as aware of how big of a problem it could be.
Right. That's kind of a marketing thing. If the government thinks we really do need to fight this war, against these other people in some other country for ideological reasons, well, you need to get your people to believe that if they don't already.
And yes, but if you incentivize it, so for instance, if you're offering or just spending time on propaganda or offering incentives to join the military, you're using taxpayer dollars to do that, which means you're taking other resources from your country to convince other people to give you more resources to give an idea that people don't necessarily agree with.
But are they really going to be wasting those resources? In the United States, our national debt just keeps climbing, and we don't really think of money as being a limiting factor in these cases.
Which I think is a problem in and of itself.
Right.
But sure. So I had said that, the country is using resources to be able to spend resources, and your argument is, oh, well, they're not really using the resources.
I think that's true in the U.S., maybe not other countries.
I think that's just a cop-out in the sense that how do you analyze money, and money isn't really tangible, and just because it's not tangible doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In the end, they are using resources.
Right. But you can also look at it as the government thinks that this is good for the people. Even if the people right now don't know what's good for them.
I need to clarify. Particular people in the government believe it.
Right.
It comes down to people, and people are fallible.
Right. And if these people in the government think that they are doing the right thing for the people by fighting this war and convincing people to fight in this war, then in reality, that's kind of what the people wanted. Most of these people in the government that they voted for, they voted for them. They are their representatives.
I think that what they would need for that type of a war, where it's an ideological war, I think they need the support of the people. That they were voted in because they have certain support from the people. But for something where you are going to be fighting a war and forcing individuals within your votership to put their lives on the line, that is something that you need the consent from the people. That you can do other things and vote on bills that will affect the people, but when you are actively putting their lives on the line, you need the consent from the people. And I think that a better way to do that, rather than having a draft, would be to say, we need people in the military, and it is the job of the people in the government to convince the citizens this is why it's critical that you join the military right now. If they cannot convince you, then they have no business putting your life on the line.
And I think that makes total sense.
Which is not something that we saw in Vietnam, or at least while there was an attempt at communicating the problems that we saw, or the problems that the government
it didn't work out so well.
Right. And the fact that it wasn't working meant that the people don't agree. You're trying to communicate the problem. The people don't agree. Okay. You're not going to be fighting in that war.
Yep. Or you can only use the volunteers that you have. You don't get more people.
I agree. I think that the draft in that case, where it's an ideological war, it should not be forced. So to quick do a recap, we're going to talk about other types of external wars, but if it's a war within, should you be able to be drafted to protect your country?
Yes.
And why?
Yes, because it is your home and your way of life. You are protecting yourself, essentially.
But if you're unwilling to protect it, like you yourself are unwilling to protect it, then it's not a way of life that should be necessarily protected unless others come in and believe that they should add protection to you.
Yes.
In which case, I think that you should not be drafted. If people are knocking down your doors and pointing guns at you, and that isn't enough to make you want to join the military and fight against them, you have made your choice. There shouldn't be a draft to force you to do it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So war within, no draft. War without, for ideological purposes, government can put resources into trying to convince people to join, but no draft. Agreed?
Yeah.
What about a war without, where there is an active threat? And I think an example of that, again, following the U.S. example, the 9/11 terror attacks, where an organized group of militaristic individuals from the Middle East came to the U.S., had an attack on U.S. soil, and we were already actively involved in a conflict over there, but that's when things started to ramp up because we realized, okay, we have been attacked. So that's one where there's an active threat, so not just an ideological threat, but an active military threat coming against us. At that point, is it okay to have a draft to squash that threat?
I mean, ideally, like other situations, you shouldn't. In the case of 9/11, having the Twin Towers fall and seeing that a lot of people thought, wait a minute, I need to protect this, and did sign up to join the military.
So what you're saying is maybe Bush actually did 9/11 and it was actually an inside job, and that was the government propaganda to convince people that we need to fight in the war. It was 9/11 was an inside job.
Oh no. Oh no. Not quite that rabbit hole.
And I'm being facetious here.
Right. But it brought up the point of they wanted to protect the United States. They saw that there was a threat and they wanted to help protect us.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't need prodding from the government to do that after seeing the threat.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a perfect example of if things are happening that convince people to voluntarily join, that's enough. And if the actions that are or the things that are happening are not enough to convince people, then that's where they are. People will make their own decisions, and you can't force them into making those decisions. And that's what the draft is. It's forcing you to make a decision. I think that the only benefit for the draft and forcing people to join the military or provide military service is in the instance of an external threat is still small, and you want to prevent that from becoming a big threat.
But even in that case, you are going to need to convince your soldiers that, hey, this small threat is still a threat that we need to be fighting against, so that they can see this threat as the enemy.
And that's going to be a more difficult thing to sell.
Right.
Because it's still a small threat, and you need people who are smart enough to see the big picture.
And typically, those are not the people that you're getting in the military.
Right. And I mean, it's more to say that it takes an average person to get into the military, or maybe slightly above average, but it may take a very above average person to understand the big picture of why it's so dangerous or why a particular enemy is so dangerous that you need to fight against them actively. It's also harder to convince people to shoot at other people when they're not being shot at first. That when you see, oh, these people are a threat, you need to go kill them. It can be really difficult to convince people that you need to do that when those people aren't actively hurting you.
Yeah, those other people that you should be considering the enemy have to be dehumanized quite a bit.
Which is really dangerous when you start dehumanizing people and saying, oh, well, they're less than human. That's how we got many of the atrocities in the 20th century. So it sounds like we're kind of going along the same lines of, even if it's not an ideological war, even if it's a threat, the better case would be convince people that war is the only option and not force them into going into war.
Yeah, that's the only way you're going to have people who are doing it because they believe in it. And if they believe in it, they're going to do a better job.
Does the same thing apply to, for instance, World War II, where atrocities were being committed, millions of people were being killed, but it wasn't necessarily your own people? So for the U.S., U.S. soldiers were not being killed, but European soldiers were being killed in the millions. So is it our responsibility, or is the U.S.'s responsibility to go across the sea and fight for in defense of those people, or should it just be on the government to communicate things and convince the people of the U.S. that, hey, people are dying, you have an obligation to go protect those people? Or should it be at the point of a gun of, you are going to go, sorry, cat again, that you're going to go across the sea and fight for the defense of other people that you don't know?
I think the government has to convince people. The people have to want to fight. Especially in the case of World War II, there are going to be a lot of people who don't want to go defend people they don't know. As much as they may disagree with all the atrocities going on, it's still really hard to leave your family and put your life on the line for people you don't know.
And even if you are, and again, I think that the draft wasn't really a thing, at least to a large degree, or at least as contentious of a degree as it was in Vietnam during World War II. That while it may have existed, it's not something that's well known in history, or at least World War II is not known for that. It was an unpopular war in the beginning until the U.S. got attacked, in which case, okay, yeah, we will start to become involved. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the idea of the draft is effectively your own government pointing a gun at you and saying you will fight. And it sounds like we pretty universally agree that, yeah, that's not okay. You should try to convince them, use resources to convince the public that this is the right thing to do. This is the moral thing to do, right?
Yep.
What about while you're fighting? And an example of this, I don't know if the U.S. did it, but there were a couple instances in the beaches of Normandy where, as boats were coming up to the landing, people in the back of the boat were instructed, the soldiers in front of you need to move forward. And the soldiers were aware of this, that if you do not move forward off of the boat, you will be shot in the back. And part of the reason behind that is, as you're moving forward, you are going to be shot at by machine guns. There was a very high likelihood that you were going to die as you charged up the beach, especially in the first wave. Which is why people in the back of the boats were told, if people aren't moving forward, they need to move forward. You are instructed to shoot them in the back. And I don't think I don't know if that ever actually happened. It may have just been a story for the soldiers to make sure that they understood, yes, you need to move forward because you're going to be shot either way. And the only chance that you have is to move forward towards the guns that you might dodge versus the guns in the back that are more likely to actually hit you. That's a perfect example, I think, of your own government pointing a gun at you and saying, fight. Even if the soldiers there believe that what they're fighting for is a good cause, they're still putting their lives on the line and may actually need coaxing at the point of a gun. Is that equally as wrong as having a draft?
That's tricky. Because I don't love the idea of my government pointing a gun at me and telling me to fight. But in the case of Normandy, where they knew that they were probably going to die when they got off that boat, but they wouldn't have a chance if they stayed on the boat. There was no way that they could contribute to the battle, or in the case of having soldiers at the back pointing their guns forward, they definitely weren't going to survive.
Well, and it was a necessary thing that people started storming the beaches because you were going to have other waves that were going to be coming afterwards. And so if you didn't go, you would risk the lives of more individuals later on. So
right. And even if you understand that, there's still so much fear running straight into machine gun fire.
And that kind of goes along with the big picture that your life is not as valuable as the lives of the several boats behind you, that there is a certain value to life, and sometimes you need to expend that cost to save the lives of others. And I think that goes back, that's a hard and fast example of this is an application of pointing a gun at your own people to make them do something that will protect other individuals, which I think is the idea behind the draft, where you are using the point of a gun, or at least the threat of the point of a gun, to force people into fighting to protect other individuals. So if the idea of pointing a gun at the backs of your own soldiers to make sure that they go forward and fight in an instance where even if they agree with you ideologically, they may not agree with you enough to put their lives in active danger and literally dodging bullets. If we agree that that's okay to an extent, where is the line that's drawn between that and where we seem to be in agreement that you should not have the threat of a gun if it's not an immediate threat? Is it literally just that if there's no immediate threat of danger, you cannot threaten your own people at the point of a gun?
I think that definitely plays into it. Because if there's no threat of danger, then a gun is overkill.
And I agree with you to an extent. I think that the difference is, and the line should be drawn where it's an immediate threat of danger. So, for instance, let's take a similar example where you have a unit of soldiers that need to go into harm's way and perform a really, really risky reconnaissance operation, something along those lines, that there's a high likelihood of them dying. Should you be able to force them into doing it?
I don't think you should be able to force them. I would hope that you would have enough volunteers who think that the mission is important enough to their country to do it. But unfortunately, in a mission that has a high likelihood where you are not going to come back alive, I don't think you would have enough volunteers.
Right. And it's the idea of, in the military, you do what you're told. You are subordinate to your superiors. You can ask questions or express concerns, but in the end, you do what you're told, because if you don't, it's not just your life on the line, but others. That you need to be a coherent team for military operations to be successful. And if you only do that voluntarily, things can start to fall apart.
They're pretty much guaranteed to fall apart once you get into combat zones.
Depending on the willingness of people. That if everyone there is willing, it's not that bad. But as soon as you start getting to actually putting your life on the line, I think people start to become a lot less willing. You may join the military saying, yeah, I'm okay with sacrificing my life. And then as bullets start flying...
yeah, it's a very different situation.
Right. So you need to be a very special kind of person to actively put yourself in harm's way, not just joining the military, but then also choosing to put yourself into a dangerous situation and take those difficult operations, putting yourself in harm's way. And I think that if we rely on just voluntary people volunteering, you may end up having a lot of gaps in your service.
Yeah, you're definitely not going to have people going on that reconnaissance mission, especially if they don't know the big picture behind why it's so important.
And not everyone can know the big picture.
Right.
So there has to be some sort of subordination in the military, whether or not it's voluntary. And in the Beaches of Normandy example, that's a good example of subordination has to be mandatory. Under all, regardless of the person, how voluntarily the person is behaving, there needs to be some sort of forced subordination, even at the point of a gun. And I think the further away from combat, the less likely you should be able to use the point of a gun as a threat. But at what point should the threat of a gun be removed from the equation at all? Because in the case of a draft, if you're draft dodging, you can be arrested, you can be put in jail, and if you struggle against that, then you start facing the threat of a gun. It's very detached, but it's still there in the background. So at what point should it go away completely? And I think a lot of what we've been talking about is it should go away completely at the start. Either that before you are in the military, there should be no threat of a gun.
Exactly.
Once you're in the military, then it should start being increasingly likely.
Yes.
If you're in a combat situation, maybe there should be an active threat of a gun because it's either their guns or ours. And then if you're in an instance where the military is looking for individuals to fulfill an operation or carry out an operation, the threat of a gun should be there, or at least a court-martial or something.
Yeah, there's going to have to be something there to get people to do it.
Not necessarily, hey, you're going to do this mission, or we're going to take you out behind the shed and shoot you.
Yeah, that would be way too extreme.
And I think that we're assuming that people can't be convinced a little too much.
Probably. Because in a lot of these cases, if you're told that this is extremely important, maybe you're not told all of the details, but you get the sense that what I am doing is important to make our country better and safer and protect us. I think people would be okay.
I think you would be surprised. More surprised than you realize. Have you read the book Ordinary Men?
No.
It's a great example of exactly what we're talking about. It's a book about a group of Polish police officers. They were ordinary men. They had joined the police force, most of them middle age, so they were not indoctrinated particularly, but they were just living in Poland as normal police officers. Then during World War II, the Nazis came in, took over Poland, and they needed resources to help maintain a police state in Poland and maintain control in Poland. The book Ordinary Men follows a group of these police officers that were just Polish police officers under Nazi rule, and as orders came down during the occupation, they were starting to be instructed to kill Jews. As in, their superiors came down and said, hey, so today, you guys are responsible for carrying out these orders, and that includes killing Jews. They had a physician come out, and this is going to get a little graphic, but they had a physician come out and say, here's how to properly kill someone. That with a gun, if you shoot them here, there's going to be blood everywhere, and they're going to die slowly. If you want to only have to use one bullet, shoot them exactly here. It won't be as messy. You're less likely to get blood on you. And this is how to kill people. So in the case of an ordinary police officer that legitimately wanted to do good by his country, if his superior came down and said, here's how to kill someone, you're going to go start killing people, what sort of a reaction would you expect?
I mean, thinking back to that time period, I wouldn't question it.
What do you mean?
Because knowing what else was going on in the world at the time and how the Nazis were treating people.
But we know how they were treating people. The Polish police officers didn't. So not knowing that, if your superior just said, you're going to start having to kill people, like you've been invaded, but he's saying, you're still a member of the police, you have to start killing people. Would you expect most people to not follow it?
That's what I'd hope would happen, but I expect most people did follow it.
And that ended up being what happened. The particular group of police officers that this book, Ordinary Men, followed were the police officers that ended up being some of the most murderous in the war. They killed tens of thousands of Jews in a short period of time, I believe on the order of months, and killed tens of thousands in Poland. Not in concentration camps. A lot of them were sent to concentration camps, but they were ordinary police officers that ended up taking women and children out, like taking pregnant women, stripping them down in a field, and shooting them in the back of the head. The weirdest thing was it was done voluntarily. There was no threat of force against them. They were told, do this. If they said, no, I'm not going to do this, their superior said, okay, I'll put you on a different duty. I'll send you over here. You'll be on some sort of cleanup or organizational thing. You won't actually be shooting people. Other individuals that were able to start shooting people, they would maybe kill 10, 20, 30 people, start throwing up because they were sickened by what they were doing, talk to their superior saying, I can't do any more of this. Okay, we'll move you somewhere else. It was done voluntarily. It was not done at the threat of force or at the point of a gun. They killed people because that is what they were told to do, and they didn't want to appear like they weren't carrying their weight relative to their comrades.
It's terrifying that it took so little.
Which is the whole point of the book. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is the idea that we've been assuming up to this point that you need to coax people and you need to convince people, but I think that you'd be very surprised at how little it actually takes for people to do horrific things. Even if they don't understand the big picture, just being told, this is what you need to do, here's how to do it. If you are in a situation where you're at war, or you've been invaded, or you're in a questionable state, you don't know what right is. If you're being told to do something, you do everything that you can to carry that out, unless you absolutely can't. And I think that in those cases, you would be surprised at what you're capable of. And this is part of the idea of what the main problem behind post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not what people saw necessarily that puts them into that state. It's what they saw themselves doing, that they didn't expect themselves to be capable of doing certain things. That those tend to be, I believe, the worst cases of PTSD, is when you carry some horrific act out that you didn't know you were capable of. And I think that in the case of the draft and performing military actions, if there's actually a need and you're in the situation and you're in the military and a questionable operation needs to be carried out, I think that you don't actually need to generally force people to do that. That even if they don't understand the big picture, they understand that they don't understand the big picture and know that other people probably do, and I need to carry out my orders without question. So I think that while we're trying to determine the question here of to what degree can the point of a gun be used, it should not be used to get people into the military. Once people are in a combat situation, maybe it should be used under very certain circumstances to continue moving people forward. But I think the gray area there, we kind of luck out, because it seems to be that you don't actually need to have the point of a gun. There are exceptions to that, with needing court-martials or arresting people or kicking them out of the military. But for the most part, even in horrific circumstances, people are more willing than I think we realize to carry out actions that come from their superiors for fear of being excluded from the group.
Yeah.
So I realized that it got really heavy here at the end, but should we sum up?
Yeah, I think it's time for that.
So the topics that we covered were, at the beginning, a war within. That if there's a war within, you may not necessarily be prepared for it. If you aren't prepared for it, it is on your people to recognize that, hey, we're being invaded, we need to join the military. And if your people are unwilling to join the military or incapable of joining the military, then the position that you're in, that's where you end up. That you need to have voluntary input. And it tends to be easier when people are invading you. People are more likely to fight back. And if you're not, that's your decision. That is a collective decision by the people, and you reap what you sow. Related to that, though, you would hope that people external to your country would be able to help out, or from other states within your country would be able to help out in protecting your ideology. But if your ideology leads to you being invaded and that invasion staying, then to an extent you are responsible for getting yourself out of that, and a draft should not be required for that because you're forcing people. Agreed?
Agreed.
If you have a war without, if it's an ideological war, or if it's a war of direct threat, if you force people to fight for you, you're forcing them to fight for an ideology that they may not understand or have the big picture on. And you shouldn't force them to do that because they won't believe in it, and there will be more negative consequences for how people view the government if their lives or the lives of their children or fathers or mothers are being ended for the sake of an ideology that they don't understand or agree with. So in the cases of external wars, instead of putting money into the selective service or employing those folks that are looking for or enforcing the draft, that money should be, as much as I hate saying it, put towards propaganda or at least advertisement for here is why you should be fighting for us and why you should join the military and fight for us. Agreed?
Agreed.
And in the case of at what point should the threat of a gun be used, it sounds like we agree that it should not under any circumstances be used for getting people into the military. Once people are in the military and actively on an operation where they're at direct risk of dying, then the threat of a gun might be under very certain circumstances used to make people continue moving forward, such as the beaches of Normandy, that, hey, you need to move forward because other people their lives are also actively on the line, and you not moving increases the likelihood of them dying. So you need to move, and if you don't, we will force you to move with our own guns. That there it might be justified under very specific circumstances. Agreed?
Agreed.
And during military service, when you need volunteers or individuals to carry out certain actions or operations that are very risky, as long as you maintain the demeanor in the military of subordination being necessary, we kind of have an out that by human nature, we want to be part of the group, and particularly in the military, we should be part of the group, and we feel that, and so we're more likely to carry out the actions regardless of how atrocious they are. So while you're in the military, the threat of a gun isn't really necessary because of human nature.
Yeah.
Agreed? And also a kind of a minor topic that we had talked about, for a decent period of time, the idea that if you are looking for people to join the military, you should not be looking for a particular type of person. You should have jobs that need to be filled, both combat and non, and both men and women should be equally marketed to in an attempt to fill out those roles, have them be required to meet the same standards across the board, regardless of sex, and put them into roles. However, if they do go into combat roles, for now at least, it seems to be a better option to keep male units and female units separate, not having co-ed units until we can, as a society and as individuals, figure out how to best commingle in co-ed instances.
Makes sense to me.
All right. Well, hey, I have some yard work that needs to be done. Can I draft your assistance? Or do I need to convince you that it needs to be done?
Well, I don't know. Can you give me a big picture summary? Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.